All right. Well, I want to thank everybody for catching up with us on this follow-up call. We're calling Mastermind Braintrust, if you will, from a couple of our previous presenters who shared the idea that after we've had a live webinar that we do a follow-up call with some questions. We had a couple of interesting ones here for Dr. Markman, who was with us last week on the 14th. I'm glad to have him back for these. I thought one in particular was following up on a concept you kind of talked about at the tail end of the webinar and didn't have a lot of time to talk about, but was very interesting, I think, for folks who were on it and wanted to know a little bit more about it. I'm trying to remember how I phrased the question. I can't remember how the question was phrased, but it was the family, neighbor, stranger concept you talked about.
Yeah. So let's. The best way to think about this is, let me just give a quick review of those three kinds of relationships, and then sort of embed this a little bit more into that rural context. So the idea behind these relationships is that they differ along several dimensions, but the two most important, are the level of trust that you've got, the level of knowledge and understanding of the people that you're working with, and what that does is to shift the nature of the transactions that you engage in, the time horizon over which you settle things up. And that ranges from strangers on the one hand, where you have very little trust, you don't know them, they don't know you. Everything has to be specified contractually, and where you really try to make all your payments right away. You can't go to the store to borrow eggs, you have to buy them. And when you engage in working with a new business, you have a contract with them, and that contract specifies obligations from each party, and it specifies those in detail, as well as specifying the penalties associated with not fulfilling those obligations. And we have a whole legal system behind it for trying to enforce those terms. So that's strangers. On the extreme other end is family. With family, you have a very deep, trusted relationship with them, and you don't really keep score. You just do things for family, and you don't really say, well, I've done enough. Now it's now you have to do things. I mean, eventually you can get fed up with family members, but basically you do tremendous amounts for them, and the relationship just kind of exists for all time. But in the middle, is this notion of the neighbor. Neighbors are the folks you do know, you do have a trusted relationship, you do engage with them, you understand their goals, you're aligned with them. But at the same time, what that enables you to do is to expand out that time horizon over which everything has to settle up. So you can borrow eggs from your neighbor if you're baking a cake, but you better bring over a slice or do something nice for them later. And in the business and government kinds of contexts, we do help our neighbors out. We do we sometimes give a little bit of extra help for a struggling business that's trying to start up in the downtown area, and maybe get people to show up or go over and help them with their books a little bit, or whatever it is. Offer some things that don't necessarily require cash on the barrel to do that work right now, but with the expectation that as that business thrives, that it's going to contribute back to the community in various ways, and that we build that neighborhood by having people do things for each other, and take what they need at times, but also give back what they can. And it's what enables that civic engagement that we want. Whether it's people supporting little league teams, or participating in local government. And so I think that there are several places in rural communities where I think this needs to play out. I mean, one of them is, as we think about building up partnerships to build up downtown areas. So a lot of our rural communities have Main Street projects that have had various degrees of success. And building up the Main Street really does require people to give a certain degree of grace to their to the people who are trying to build businesses, to give them opportunities, maybe to be a little bit generous in the terms of loans, or to do a lot more to drive people towards those businesses, to make it less competitive and more cooperative, or to use a term of art these days, this notion of co-opetition, where you are to some degree in competition with other businesses, but if you recognize that if you have a thriving downtown, it floats all the boats in that downtown, then you don't have to be purely in competition. You can actually think of your competition as you're trying to enhance the downtown or to enhance the region, potentially at the expense of neighboring regions or neighboring towns. And so I think it's building up that sense of cooperation, but also recognizing that we need all of the elements of the business, government, and education cycle to be part of the growth of communities. I think that we have created a political environment in which the business community sometimes sets itself up in opposition to government. There's been a certain amount of love-hate relationship between communities and education institutions on both sides. And I think that one of the things that we need to do is to create more deeper relationships. We've gone to a number of rural communities, for example, that have local colleges and universities in them, where those colleges and universities provide some student dollars to support stores, but they don't really engage with the community. They don't go to the universities, or colleges don't necessarily go out of their way to look for internships for students in those communities and to find ways to get those students involved in some of the local businesses, encouraging them to start small businesses on their own and to locate them in the region. So I think there's a lot that education institutions can do to be part of the neighborhood. But similarly, I think that communities can court those education institutions as good neighbors, and work with them to try to get the kind of workforce development they need to reach some of their goals. And I think that this is also where government can come in, that civic government can play a role in enhancing that kind of neighborhood and trying to create partnerships and provide even some seed funding for programs that might engage students or might engage workforce development, and also speed the process of making use of more statewide and federal resources for workforce development. So, often there are state funds for doing workforce development, but the local community civic government really needs to play a leading role in that. But that's only going to happen if everybody's really aligned and working on the same page to make that happen. And one last thing about this, which is, part of the way that you create those neighborhoods is just by getting people to interact together and see the commonality in their goals. So it means spending a little time in the development of that relationship, having some evening meetings at the local library where you get representatives from business, government, education together to talk about their goals, to talk about the things that they need, and to do that in a way that ultimately helps people to find those commonalities. Because without those kinds of conversations, you don't begin to develop the trust. And then once you've developed that within the borders of your community, then beginning to do that regionally, trying to get people together from neighboring towns and getting community leaders together to do that same kind of planning, and to begin to recognize that there is also some degree of alignment in across the borders of communities that might allow regional development to happen. So I think it's something that has to grow first within communities and then has to grow more broadly. And then I guess I said I was going to stop, but I'll say one more thing, which is also to make sure that neighborhood incorporates as much diversity as possible. So that diversity is not just getting business, government, and education together, but also making sure that you are inclusive of the variety of subpopulations within the community. That it creates a lot of local tension when you have significant populations within the community who are not represented in the planning meetings and in the growth.
It's interesting you went towards the diversity, because I think even when the communities, in my experience here, is even when there isn't that, because a lot of small areas, they don't have diversity per se being a huge issue. In a lot of cases, it's really just getting the people at the table. In your experience, what's been one of the best ways of kind of greasing the wheels a little bit? Because that's almost always the main buffer for a lot of these groups, whether it's even within a small just downtown area, coming together to see that they will work work better together.
Yeah, I mean, the nice thing about small towns is there aren't a lot of people, right? I mean, it's not that there's nobody, but you can develop more individual relationships. So you can actually, I mean, what it takes is for a small group of core leadership to actually call on people and say, hey, I just want to get together with you and introduce you to what we're trying to accomplish and get you to come to a couple of meetings to get to know everybody and to talk about some of these plans. And it's one of these things where somebody's got to make the first move. And I think that if you're interested in growth, then part of what you have to do is to make those calls, and that includes that includes finding the people who aren't necessarily participating now but could participate, and it might involve bringing some churches into the mix or others into the mix, and just inviting people to come and to talk about their hopes, dreams, and their concerns, and then to see where there's commonality in what people are trying to accomplish. Because if a community can also speak with one voice, that can help to get some of the other resources that might be needed. So if there is a need to build up broadband infrastructure in a community, for example, the more community elements that can be brought together in service of making that case, the more likely you're going to be able to get resources to help make that happen. So getting the community to sing a little bit more like a choir can be helpful.
That actually probably gets to the second question that was kind of a carryover from last week, which was I'm trying to remember how we phrased it, but it was in essence in terms of getting people to interact at the civic level, in particular with when it involves government, which almost inevitably, almost any of these economic development things do. How do you not ruffle local feathers, if I remember correctly?
Yeah.
I'm probably saying it wrong, but it was kind of the gist of it.
Framed it. Yeah, and listen, it's I think that a commitment to growth has to involve a commitment to some degree of change. And we see this in lots of communities that we've worked with, that there is an old guard that is resistant to doing things differently than they've been done before. As a psychologist, I will say, we often have people talk about the kind of lay definition of insanity which is to do the same thing repeatedly and expect a different outcome. If you're trying to generate economic growth, and you haven't been seeing economic growth, then if you continue to do all and only the things that you've been doing in the past, you're unlikely to get a different outcome. So part of what, that doesn't mean that a community needs to completely change its character, but it does mean that it has to be open to the prospect that things are going to be done a little bit differently. And part of doing things a little differently is to have an openness to new voices. And to allowing new people to get involved. And so part of what that means is that those people who are working hard to drive economic growth have to work with those people who have some entrenched interests, who have a long history with the community, to really sit down with key leaders and say, look, let's really figure out, what our goals are and recognize the kinds of change that are going to have to be involved if we're going to reach those new goals, and that we have to embrace that change. And in fact, in many ways, the best way for longtime residents and people who've had a lot of civic authority in the past, whether it's formal authority in terms of activity of the government or whether it's just authority by virtue of their social position in the community, that people who want to retain that position are going to do it best by being open to the change and being a part of it and embracing the people who continue to get involved. Because that's, the best way to ensure that a community grows responsibly without changing its character is for the people who are going to, the people who've been involved in the past to embrace the idea that things have to change, and then to try to do that in a way that allows the voice of the long-term character of the community to play a role in how that growth happens. And so, it has to be inclusive of everyone. And the fact is that you can't get anything done in small communities if you don't get the key players to buy into it, because they can just dig their heels in and make sure nothing happens, which doesn't benefit the community, but it does make sure that they don't lose anything. So it's a lot of people skills. It's funny, people who go to business school talk about how you get an MBA degree and you get one class in what they sometimes sneeringly call the soft skills. And then you get out in the world and you realize that ability to get along with people and to motivate people and to think about how to get them to change their attitudes and their behavior, that's often 90% of the battle. And so, I think people who are interested in economic growth have to be good people, and they have to be particularly good people when they're working in rural communities.
I like that, the people. And it reminds me too, and something that occurred to me as we were talking about these, and it kind of popped in my head earlier when I sent these to you, was that in a lot of cases, and maybe you have some good examples of where, in a lot of cases, I think it does take in the key players like you mentioned, but oftentimes there's, especially for narrow issues, there's almost always a champion that really kind of steps forward and carries the ball in a lot of cases. I don't know if that's your experience, or again, if you have any good examples where you've seen that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think this is true in almost any community. I mean, small or large. You can't make decisions by committee, and you can't implement things by committee. You can give particular assignments to people to do, but at some point you need someone who is leading the charge, who's the point person, who's making sure that things get done, and who puts the time and energy into making sure that tasks get completed. So, for example, when I think I mentioned during the talk the example of Lufkin, Texas, and the individual there who has helped to build up that downtown area has taken on a tremendous amount of responsibility for himself. He's the one who organized a set of wealthy residents to form the alternative financing arrangement that he's used to buy some of the distressed properties and to get the money to renovate those properties before getting the bank loans that enabled him to pay off those investors. He also, single-handedly helped a number of small businesses to get off the ground by co-investing with them as they got started, but also by working on some of their back-end financial processes so that once money started coming in, that they had a real business plan that would enable them to stay solvent, after which he would then back out of the business, right? He wasn't interested in owning a bunch of businesses. He was just interested in getting them safely off the ground and then letting these entrepreneurs, run their business and profit from it. So, knowing, of course, that because he owned most of the buildings that these were located in, that he was going to generate some revenue through the commercial real estate transactions. But There was a single individual there who had an outsized influence on the way the communities work, and we've seen that in other places as well. Childress, Texas, is trying to revamp some of their businesses downtown, and again, they have an individual who's a longtime resident there who has really taken the lead on trying to galvanize that process. So I think you do need to have these champions. I think it's very hard to get things to work when you don't have a champion, and that champion often needs to be somebody who has a real personal interest in addition to a professional interest in making this happen. It has to be somebody who cares deeply about the community. I think, a lot of times communities will say, well, we'll hire someone to run our chamber, we'll hire someone to run our EDC or SBDC, and that person will play that point role. But, when you have somebody who's got their own career aspirations, and those career aspirations may not involve spending the rest of their life in this small town, you get some amount of work that gets done, but it tends to be a little bit more transactional. And having somebody who just cares about the community really deeply. And I'm not saying it can't be a professional, I'm just saying it often isn't. That having somebody who cares deeply about that community and really wants to put that effort in to see it succeed is almost always the difference between those communities that see a big turnaround and those that don't.
I think that dovetails nicely. We had our July presenter was talking about rural millennials who are in many cases choosing to come in, and either in some cases coming back home, and in other cases choosing an area for its rural environment. And we were talking, because that was one of the crucial things that he said that you see is that they have to be willing and able to, and one of the things he encouraged was getting involved, because that action alone, like you're saying, was probably one of the crucial things to sell people who'd been there their entire lives. Even if somebody was returning, in some cases, it doesn't necessarily translate to loyalty to the area. So
right.
It is a component that you have to you just have to get out there. And in most cases, I think the thing that a lot of folks forget is that almost all of this takes time.
Yeah.
I think too many folks want stuff now.
Yeah, no, I think there's a desire for some instant gratification, and it is a process. But one of the things that we've been trying to instill, with our Home to Texas program, which is our internship program that sends students early in their undergraduate careers back home. One of the reasons that we do that is because when you go to those small towns, you actually get exposure to all of the community leadership. So the students in our Home to Texas program invariably get some face time with the mayor, with other civic leaders, and it's an interesting experience, because if you live in a city, I live in Austin, Texas. We're a city of over 1 million people. I don't bump into the mayor regularly. I have met the mayor, but not everybody does necessarily meet the mayor or their city council people. It's become a big, it's a city, and so you don't necessarily have personal access to the leadership structure of the community, and yet in a small town, it's very easy to get integrated into that civic leadership. And if you show interest and desire, you can be a part of it. And I think when students begin to realize that, and they realize, I could go back to that community, or I could settle in this place and have an outsized impact because of the proximity to where all of the levers are to make things happen, that's often a really attractive thing. In a world in which I think a lot of people feel a little bit powerless. We see social media, which is this huge set of forces, and if you look at your social media presence and you say, well, I've got 500 Twitter followers, how am I ever going to have the kind of influence that this person who's got 30 million followers has? You can begin to feel like your actions don't necessarily matter. But you go to a small community, you get involved in the goings on there, you get involved trying to influence civic life, and you can have an enormous influence on the lives of the people around you and on the entire region, because they need people who can bring that energy and enthusiasm.
That's a great point, especially for the younger folks and anybody who has the time. I think one of the things that we're finally starting to see addressed here, and I don't know if it's interesting, you've got the Home to Texas program. One of the things we're seeing more of is the boomers retiring into the rural areas, of course, for a variety of reasons. But and again, I think it's going to be a mixed result. But I would think that folks who either are returning or in many cases are choosing rural as kind of their last stopping point for retirement. It is something to make sure we're engaging them in.
Oh, absolutely. You know, one of the things that a lot of the folks who've chosen to retire in smaller communities can do is actually to reach out to that rising generation and share that expertise. You know, you have people who are bringing a lifetime of experience in the communities that they live in, with the businesses or the other roles that they played. And, you know, rather than forcing the rising generation to reinvent the wheel, I mean, serving that mentoring role for people, giving back to the community at a time when, you know, a lot of folks, you know, who are retired, they're able, you know, they're moving to these rural areas because they can live a comfortable life there. So they're not necessarily looking to you know, for the next hustle, but they certainly could enhance what younger people are doing. And so being part of that mentoring network is I think absolutely crucial, because it allows communities to do some things without necessarily making all the same mistakes again. So and sometimes, you know, I think it's invigorating, right? If you're early retirement age, you know, to be around people who are trying to make things happen and to see things grow and change can be exciting, even though you can then go home at the end of the day and leave it to somebody else to actually get that stuff done.
Well, I think one of the things, especially bringing it back to what we do, is that we are seeing quite a few folks who are in that retirement, and even though they're retiring, in some cases they already are, and in some cases, you know, they're getting to that point. But we've seen this across the board as well, is that many are going back to doing either something almost as a side or as the kind of next step kind of thing that they're going to do, because they, in some cases, while they are retiring, they may not be able to afford to retire 100%. So they're looking at what is the next thing, and a lot of what we do is help them figure out, you know, the ins and outs for the business side, obviously. But we are seeing a lot more that are engaged in that entrepreneurial process, going, okay, I thought I was retiring 100%, but in many cases they're finding they're not going to be able to.
Yeah. Well, absolutely, and we've seen in a lot of small communities, you know, that SBDCs in particular end up working with a lot of you know, sole proprietors who've got a skill that they want to find a way to make a little bit of money on, you know, without necessarily working full time on it. So, you know, we were in New Hampshire working with an incubator there, and a lot of the companies that they had there involved people who, for example, you know, baked cookies or made flower arrangements or had other significant skills that they could monetize, you know, on a somewhat part-time basis, but still enhance the community a little bit and bring in a little bit of money for themselves. You know, and that's a nice resource, right? And it's a nice addition to a community. It's not, you know, obviously not the basis of economic development, because, you know, as I said in the talk, you can't sustain a community buying and selling stuff to each other, but it's nice to have those amenities in town. And some of those services, and encouraging that can add a little bit of zest or quirkiness to a community that might be a little bit generic otherwise.
Mm-hmm. Which I guess does come back to the original concept of the family, neighbor, stranger, where I think for us it's finding I know locally it's finding a lot of ways to try to make sure that people are thinking of new folks coming into the area. In particular, the census is decimated. Of course, it didn't decimate, but I mean, I think between poor results and just simple fact, it's decimated a lot of rural areas, and they need to do anything and everything they can to address that.
No, I think, and of course, I think COVID has definitely gotten people to think a little bit differently about where they live and the relationship between where they live and where they work. That has led some number of people to consider moving back out to smaller communities. Housing prices certainly have had an influence. The cities have gotten expensive, and the larger cities have gotten doubly expensive because not only is there population growth, but there's been foreign investment in the properties in those communities that have artificially driven up real estate prices to some degree, as people have been holding on to real estate as an investment. So, having an opportunity to move to a place where the cost of living might be a little bit lower is an attractive option for a lot of people, and I think that's going to have a potential influence, growth influence, at least over the next decade on smaller communities. But the communities are going to have to capitalize on that. They're going to have to find ways to cater to that and to make it an attractive place for people to want to stay. And of course, to the extent that they're trying to attract younger people, it's also, the other reason for that regional network that you want to create is what, we often bring students with us on trips to help us to understand communities, and one of the things that they point out is what they sometimes call the Tinder problem in those communities, which is the dating pool is essentially and that can make it difficult if you move as a younger person to a smaller community when you're single. So I think finding ways to have some little bit more some cross pollination, I guess, of the communities so that people don't end up moving away because there are key goals they can't fulfill living in a small town.
That's what we're all trying to do.
Yeah. No, it's.
If there's anything we missed, was there anything we missed that you wanted to mention?
I think the last thing I'll just say is, I think that the role of SBDCs in particular is one of the big roles is in helping people to map out the set of steps that they need to take to achieve those goals. I think part of the problem that communities have is, they have no shortage of ideas. My graduate advisor back in the day used to say to me all the time, ideas are cheap. Right? What's hard is turning an idea into a thing. And I think that helping communities to think, not just to think strategically, but to turn that strategic vision into a specific set of steps that when people carry them out will lead to a desired outcome. That's hard, and it's such an important role, and I think that many people in civic leadership don't have the level of experience that they need to make that happen. And so I think that the professional communities that surround that ecosystem are just so critical for creating that level of growth. So the work that you and the folks in the group are doing is, I think, just absolutely important for helping communities to thrive.
Well, thanks for bringing that back around. Yeah, we're going to continue this series as we go forward, and hope to keep working with other rural within North Carolina, of course, which is where we're targeting. But I do see, and I appreciate your time, Dr. Markman. I mean, it's been great to have outreach to other areas. I think that's one of the other unique things, and I know you do a lot of work outside of Texas, but it's great to get that kind of point of view and see what works, not just within your own state area, but throughout the entire country, and in some cases even the world, to take a look at what places are doing that are innovative and can bring some fresh perspective. So I appreciate your time.
Yeah, my pleasure. Always happy to help.
All right. Well, we're going to have this up, and we've been seeing some folks who watch this stuff after the fact. So if you catch this after the fact, if you go to bit.ly/Restore Rural NC, capital NC, you'll find all this and the recording from last week, the webinar. Dr. Markman was here, and I've already seen a couple of folks who've requested it, so we got it out already. So again, Dr. Markman, thanks for your time. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. Great talking with you.
All right.